So this is, have you tried yoga? An examination of adaptive yoga techniques. And before I get into anything else, I would love you as the listener to really listen to how the question, have you tried yoga, lands with you. And at this moment, try not to answer that question, just consider it as a question. I've titled my thesis, Have You Tried Yoga? Because this is a question that people with many different types of disabilities get asked all the time, more often than not, by people who are not disabled themselves. And a lot of the time by people who are not even yoga teachers or have no experience with yoga. And even more often, the person who is being asked the question is not really privy to what the asker even means by have you tried yoga? Because most people in the West will think of yoga as we go to the studio, we hop on the mat, we turn on the heat, we get really bendy and we sweat. The majority of the people that I have spoken to that don't already have their own yoga practice, that's pretty much what comes to mind when they hear yoga. So we're going to move into what is yoga for the purposes of this thesis and this presentation. So before we define yoga, we're going to get into the question that fueled my thesis. And that question is, how can accessibility and adaptability in mainstream yoga be increased to promote the inclusion of physically disabled individuals? And then how I'm going to begin to answer this question, I'm going to share a quote from Jivana Heyman, who was the founder of the Accessible Yoga School, who informed a lot of this research. So he says that yoga is a revolutionary practice which changes our relationship with ourselves and the world. Consider the fact that yoga philosophy is completely at odds with contemporary capitalist culture. So there's a lot to unpack here. Starting to answer the question of how can accessibility and adaptability in mainstream yoga be increased, it's important to talk about the things that make mainstream yoga inaccessible to people with disabilities. And we'll come back to Jivana Heyman's quote about how yoga philosophy is at odds with contemporary capitalist culture. So yoga has been heavily mainstreamed, commodified, and appropriated by people in the West. And where I come from in this, I am, as we can see here, a white yoga teacher. I'm female. I also have a disability. And I think that it is incredibly important not only to increase accessibility and adaptability, but to respect the roots of the tradition. For me, as a white yoga teacher, to study the roots of the tradition and to bring them into my classes, to bring them into my own practice, to learn the Sanskrit, to learn where the poses come from, and to recognize that yoga has been a thing since long before yoga studios, yoga pants, yoga props, all these things that we use now in our modern day practice were not at the essence of yoga as a practice. So another thing that makes mainstream yoga a little bit less accessible to people with disabilities that comes in line with the capitalist culture is the cost. A lot of yoga spaces, a lot of spiritual spaces, we can even expand it to that, come at a high cost due to commodification. And so I really appreciate having spaces where, you know, it's made free to people or low cost, donation based, you know, making things financially accessible because yoga at its essence is free. And it's a lot of the teachings that we are now paying a lot for, we were not paying for in the past. And that's not to say that yoga teachers shouldn't charge. You know, everyone has to make a living, right? And there are places where the commodification has risen past, what the essence of yoga really speaks. There's an energetic exchange, of course, um, and making that energetic exchange something that anyone can participate in really is at the essence of yoga practice. And so now we'll jump into what is yoga for the purposes of this presentation. So I've got 4 writers listed below. The first is Patanjali. And for my definition of yoga for this presentation, I have looked really deeply into a particular sutra from the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. So we'll talk a little bit about all of these authors and connect the threads of all their different translations and commentaries. So Patanjali was, no one really knows exactly who Patanjali was. There's a legend that Patanjali was birthed from the mother of yoga and that he wrote down the sutras and that was the first codified, written down explanation of what is yoga. And I have a sutra here. It is Sutra 1.2, and it is Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. And that translates pretty directly to yoga is the stilling or cessations of fluctuations of mind. This is this translation I got from Edwin Bryant, who we'll talk about a little bit more soon. But I want to get into what Patanjali said with Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. This is one of the first sutras on yoga, and it doesn't mention anything to do with posture. It doesn't even mention anything to do with the divine. It mentions that yoga is the stilling of the fluctuations of the mind. So it starts with yoga in the person. It starts with yoga in here. And we tend to think of the mind as only living up here. And I'd like for us to expand that idea of mind to include the entire system, body, and the way that we interact with the world. Patanjali has been translated by hundreds of different authors, commented on by hundreds of different authors. And I've got 3 here that have done a really, really beautiful job of expanding on this sutra and making it accessible not only to people with disabilities, but to the modern person. Many of these texts, unless you've had a really great teacher to help you learn or you've been to school, they can be a little bit heady for the average individual. And a big part of my mission is to kind of bring some of it down to earth while still preserving the really deep, beautiful essence that is in all of these texts. So Michael Stone defines yoga not just as a physical practice, but as a path of ethical living, psychological insight, and spiritual transformation. He emphasizes that yoga is the practice of attending to things the way they are. And for people with any kind of health condition, physical disability, concerns such as that, attending to the way things are can be incredibly hard, painful, saddening, and even for someone without a health condition, for someone who's going through something in life, attending to things exactly the way that they are is really difficult. And that is at the essence of yoga. Michael Stone draws from the sutras in his book. I'll hold up. If you're visual like me, I'm going to show you some of the books that I've drawn from in case anybody's interested in looking into these. This is The Inner Tradition of Yoga by Michael Stone, and he draws on Patanjali and several other sources to write a guide to yoga philosophy for the contemporary practitioner. And he really does a good job of reframing yoga through a modern lens. And to him, yoga is ultimately waking up to reality. And waking up to reality can mean many things. Aren't we always in some form of reality or delusion? And yoga practice, consistent, dedicated yoga practice, can bring us further and further out of our delusions and further in to the essence of what truly is, and make us more able to sit with that and be with that, regardless of what that reality is at any given moment. Stone also writes that yoga is a way of cultivating awareness and engaging with the world with compassion and clarity. This comes from the 8 limbs of yoga, where we'll get into those a little bit more throughout the presentation, but where Stone really brings them in is every interaction that we have can be in yoga. Every interaction that we have can be compassionate and with clarity. And he really encourages practitioners, especially, in this modern day and age where we're going all the time, talking to tons of people every day, to approach the world with compassion and clarity. And where this came up a lot for me in my research on how to make yoga more accessible and adaptive is approaching every person who comes into a yoga practice space with that compassion and clarity, ensuring that we are communicating to the best of our ability our needs and our expectations and what we require of everyone else to flow into the space, and then ensuring that we are assisting people in uh, getting themselves into a way that they can flow with the space. One thing about mainstream yoga spaces that has made them harder for some folks to get into is that there is a lack of that compassion and clarity coming from the teachers. And I don't want to generalize this to all mainstream yoga spaces. There has been a thread that I've noticed through interviews throughout this thesis, where clarity and compassion has been lacking in some spaces. Now we'll come down to Nishala Joy Devi. Nishala Joy Devi is a female translator. I found it very important to me personally to have some of that feminine energy and voice within this presentation. And her work really speaks to me, not just as a woman, not just as a disabled person, but as a teacher, as a practitioner. So I'm going to pull out her book for a moment. So this is the book that I have drawn from Nishala Joy Devi. It's The Secret Power of Yoga. And she translates Sutra 1.2 as well. So Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. Devi interprets this as yoga is the uniting of consciousness in the heart. So this draws from the entomological roots of yoga a little bit more, which I think is fascinating. Yoga comes from the Sanskrit root word yuj, which means to yoke. So to connect, as if you're yoking oxen to a cart, we're unifying here. So Devi is saying that yoga is uniting consciousness with the heart. And I think this also speaks to uniting Shiva and Shakti, Purusha and Prakriti, bringing together consciousness, bringing together that all-pervasive awareness with the compassionate space of the heart, which does inform a lot of our activity on this physical plane. Davies' interpretation shifts the focus from controlling the mind to fostering a compassionate union with the heart. And she suggests that yoga, true yoga, arises from a harmonizing of mental activity with inner emotional wisdom. So she really brings in elements of not just the mind and the mind stuffs, but the heart stuffs as well, the emotions, the feelings. And she encourages us in her work to acknowledge the way that we feel, acknowledge the way that the world around us makes us feel, and to unify that with an all pervasive knowing and consciousness that everything is exactly how it is. And true yoga is bringing in an air of contentment with giving space to those, wild running horses of emotion and those fluctuations of the mind that are just going and going and going. She encourages us not to try and force those things to stop. We're not trying to we're not trying to bring staleness to the mind or staleness to the body, stagnation. We're trying to bring a unification of all of the fluctuations with consciousness. So we are now going to move into one of the last scholar that I have on here that heavily informed my thesis, who is Edwin Bryant. Edwin Bryant has translated many, many texts and provided really rich commentaries. This is the book from Edwin Bryant that I used, and this is the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. It's quite a thick one. He has a really, really rich commentary on all four padas, all four sutras. Um, and Edwin Bryant's yoga is that the ultimate goal is to reach a state where the practitioner is no longer identified with the contents of the mind, but rather experiences pure awareness or purusha that exists independently of mental activity. And I really love this last part where he mentions that purusha is completely independent of mental activity. There is no level of just mind control that we can have to experience Purusha. It's always there. It pervades everything else that we have going on and exists without there being anything going on in the mind. And I think that this particular uh, commentary on the sutra really speaks to how accessible yoga is to anyone, no matter their level of mental ability. So speaking on, having like an intellectual disability, learning disability, there's no level of, quote, intelligence that is required to be able to experience union between heart and consciousness. And it is just about finding ways that the practitioner can access that. And there are so many different ways, so many different practices. I wish I could get into every single one of them today, but I just want to put in how important it is to remember that Purusha, that all pervasive consciousness, exists completely independently of intelligence. So there's no level of mind that somebody must reach in order to experience yoga at its purest, most essential form. So, what is yoga? We've talked about a little bit what it is on a philosophical level. And now, oops, not quite yet. We're going to talk about what is accessible yoga. So, accessible yoga, as defined by the Accessible Yoga Organization, is a movement dedicated to making the ancient teachings of yoga available to everyone, regardless of ability, background, or experience. The mission is to cultivate equity in yoga through ancient wisdom and modern practice, ensuring that yoga is accessible and equitable by opening the conversation, sharing tools, training for yoga teachers, therapists, and students seeking accessible practices, and providing quality education around equity issues in yoga. So this is a much more modern, less philosophical interpretation, less, little more nuanced, and brings in some of the modern concerns for yoga practice, particularly accessible yoga practice. I wanted to highlight a couple of things that this definition really brings up. So the Accessible Yoga organization, they consider accessible yoga to be not just a practice, but a movement, a revolution. And I fully, wholeheartedly agree. The making yoga accessible, particularly in the West, where yoga has been mainstreamed and commodified, is revolutionary because it completely pushes back to a lot of branding that has come with yoga. It pushes back against a lot of what society expects yoga to be. Accessible yoga is not about looking sexy in your yoga outfit. It's not about having the latest and greatest yoga mat. It's not about getting that peak pose for the Instagram post. All of those things are super valid things to do, and more power to those who want to do them. But pushing back against that and saying that this, sure, it's what we as modern practitioners, and I say we because I've definitely come into the mainstream yoga gambit. We as practitioners have made this and have made yoga into this. Um, and we a lot of practitioners have lost what is at the roots. And so what accessible yoga is doing here, they are revolutionizing modern yoga by bringing what is in the roots back up to the surface and making it inclusive, making it much more sustainable, safer, and more welcoming to more types of people, not just the ones who feel comfortable in Lululemon. So now we are going to talk about what is mainstream yoga. Are you guys able to see the screen? All our names and stuff. I'm trying to move it out of the way. Okay, there we go. That'll work. Okay, so mainstream yoga, this is not a term that I have uh, that I got from anywhere else or that I have a definition from another source from. This is a term that I codified specifically for the purposes of this thesis. Mainstream yoga is how the majority of practitioners who in the West who are currently practicing got into yoga. You know, walking into a yoga studio, to a gym, getting invited to a class by a friend. We see people over here in the grass doing some pretty challenging extended lunge pose. We've got some people over here doing some what looks like meditation on some mats. We've got another meditating yogi down here. So mainstream yoga, a few threads that I have identified is that mainstream yoga often happens on a yoga mat in a yoga studio or a gym or maybe outside. And the mainstream has really pigeonholed yoga as a physical practice that occurs on a mat that we do for an hour or an hour and a half every week, and then we go home and we forget about it. And that is not what yoga is at its essence. Yoga at its essence is something that pervades every part of our lives and that happens in relationship, it happens in community, and it is supposed to unify all of the threads of our experience rather than being a disconnected practice that we only do whenever we, have time after work or on a Saturday morning. The goal of yoga practice really truly is to bring it off of your mat and into your community and let the practice on the mat affect the way that you interact with the rest of the world. A lot of mainstream yoga, you see people doing very complicated, advanced, we'll say, poses, posting them online, and that there's a lot that I could say about that. One thing that I will say is that it's very easy to get wrapped up in the physical and wrapped up in the body whenever the focus is getting the perfect picture, putting it online. And it's very easy to forget about the energetics of yoga and the philosophy of yoga, or just to never learn it in the first place. And I'll bring us down to this photo right here. This is uh, little baby Riley in her infancy of yoga practice. This was at the end of my first teacher training in 2022, where I found this teacher training through a studio that, while I would say they are really, really fantastic at bringing in the roots, the tradition, the philosophy, the main offerings would fall into the category of a more mainstream yoga environment. It was, vinyasa flow classes, which I enjoyed so much. And coming into yoga from the mainstream lens, because that was accessible to me at that point, it really encouraged me to dig deeper. Um, I'll share a little bit about my first ever exposure to yoga, which was well before this picture. It was in 2014. I was in a friend's backyard, and her mom had hired a private yoga instructor to teach her yoga. Um, so mom, her name was Stephanie, invited us out to the yard to do her yoga class with her one day, because we were hanging out after school and we thought, okay, fun. Let's come out to the yard and do some yoga. And um, that was one of the only times throughout my middle school years that I can remember feeling really present and content in my body. I'm sure if anyone else remembers middle school, there's not a lot of time where you're feeling super present and content in your body. So it was a very alarming experience, very strange for young me. And over the years, I had a few more exposures to yoga, and I remember each of them very distinctly feeling so present, so grounded, so content, and not even really having the words in my vocabulary to describe it at this point. But I do owe those feelings to practicing yoga asana. Um, and I think it's important to note that yoga asana like this is accessible to the majority of the population at this point. Only about a quarter of the adult population is living with a physical disability. So I would never want to take away mainstream yoga or completely change it, but it's about adding in supports and adding in things to make these environments more welcoming, more accessible, more enjoyable to more people. So we are now going to move into talking about adaptive yoga. So I use adaptive and accessible yoga sort of interchangeably. I do prefer adaptive because I like that adaptive, adapting. We can make it whatever we need it to be, which accessible says about the same thing. So they're pretty interchangeable. Um, so adaptive yoga, I'm going to start with this quote from TKV Desi Kachar. Adaptive yoga is to approach your practice intelligently. To approach your practice intelligently means to know all of the implications of what you want to do and to make appropriate preparations and adjustments. So becoming a yoga teacher before I became disabled was a huge blessing and privilege to me, because when I went to start adapting my yoga practice, I had a lot of knowledge, and knew a lot of the implications of what I wanted to do, so I could make those appropriate preparations and adjustments. It was not without struggle, and it was also not without support. I've had a lot of support from great teachers who are far more experienced in yoga and adaptive yoga than I. So I bring this up because a lot of people who have been disabled their whole life or never practiced yoga before becoming disabled don't have this same privilege. They won't have this same knowledge and learned intelligence of how to make a yoga practice what they need it to be. So making yoga spaces very adaptive is important to be able to invite people who have different needs into those spaces. And I have some examples of some of the ways to meet those needs in my little pictures here. So I'm going to go through them. And my first one I'll talk about is, if you know ASL, you probably read up at the top, it says yoga. Having supports like ASL interpreters, or having teachers wear microphones, or having spaces in the room for people who may be hearing impaired or sight impaired so that they're able to see better or hear better, is a really great way to make just the space where the yoga is being practiced more inviting and more accessible. And on that same thread, having class descriptions that are very accurate to what will be going on in the room, letting people know that there will be an interpreter, the teacher will be wearing a mic, and also giving people the invitation to share what disabilities or health conditions they may have. Adding a little comment box on a website where someone is signing up, or even just a blurb on the home page that says, hey, come talk to us if you have any access needs, and we will work with you on being able to meet those needs. If there is just simply the offering there, a person is more likely to call the place up or come in and ask if the place can meet their needs. And so often it's much easier than we even think it might be. And one of the really super easy ways to make yoga more adaptive and accommodating is by using props. And I've got over here two examples of props in action in yoga, and many studios use props, right? If you've been to a yoga studio, you've probably seen blocks, bolsters, blankets, maybe straps. And a lot of the time in mainstream yoga, what I have seen and experienced is that the props are used to be able to help the practitioner move into a more challenging version of a posture. And I love that. Another place where props are used a lot is to move a practitioner into a more restorative version of a posture. Love that as well. And a lot of yoga teacher trainings and yoga schools do a really great job of teaching people how to use the props for those purposes. And where I see a lack is where yoga teachers are not often taught how to use props in order to accommodate people with different kinds of access needs. For example, chairs. Many studios may have chairs, but a lot of teachers are not equipped with knowledge on how to use those chairs in their classes. And having a chair in a class makes it accessible to so many more people, because many people struggle just to get up and down off the ground. In my interviews, I spoke to people who said that the main reason that they had not tried yoga before is because they cannot get themselves up and down off the mat. And there are many adaptive yoga schools that will offer support getting up and down off the mat, which is awesome. And we can make spaces that are not specifically adaptive yoga spaces more accessible by having an option to have a chair, whether it's to sit in or whether it's just to push down on to get up and down. And making sure that we offer prop use in a way that makes the practitioner feel like they are fully participating. And because at the essence of each posture, there is no, full expression. There is a spectrum of expressions for each pose, and one person's full expression may look completely different than another person's full expression. And encouraging people to feel how the pose feels within their body, how it's affecting their mind, their breath, and encouraging them to focus on things other than it looks brings postural yoga practice closer to that essence, that all pervasive divine consciousness. Because when we're convening with the divine, hopefully we're not too worried about what we look like, what we sound like, what the room around us looks like. Once we are in the practice, it is about getting to that full expression in the way that is the fullest for us, not comparing ourselves to what another practitioner did as their fullest expression, and really just allowing our expression to flow out of us. And the more that we surrender our egos and allow the expression to flow out, the fuller the expression will be. And then I'll come down to this last picture is me teaching a yoga class. This was actually my first adaptive yoga class, first class I ever taught since after becoming disabled. And I add this picture in just to honor this group of people and the space that we worked in together, because um, I came into teaching yoga as a very able-bodied, hot yoga, go, 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 let's jump around kind of teacher. And I was very scared to come back into teaching, knowing that I would have to accommodate myself a lot more. And what was so beautiful was my lovely students in this class, this group of women, we them seeing me accommodate myself made them much more eager and open to share with me accommodations that they needed. And we were able to find creative ways to use all different kinds of props. We were able to find creative ways to bring in meditation and breath work to work with everything that everyone in the room had going on. It was a really beautiful, unified experience. And this class was not advertised as an adaptive or accessible yoga class. It was actually advertised as a core class. So it was really amazing to be able to expand that definition of what we advertise the class as, to bring in not just the physical core, since that's what we were referencing in our advertisement. By just a few weeks in, we really redefined what we thought core meant, and it was more about the core of ourselves and the core of our being. And just to speak on spiritual accessibility for a few moments, I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. I'm not sure if I mentioned, but that's where I was teaching this class. And St. Louis, Missouri is a very Christian area. So a lot of the spiritual parts of yoga are a little inaccessible, just because you know people don't know about it. It's being raised in a Christian church and being raised with Hinduism or Buddhism or Islam. It's all different. So another way that I made this class more spiritually accessible to the group of people that I had was to bring in some philosophy from the Bible and do some readings from Christian authors in class, and then kind of relate them back to yoga teachings. I would find myself bringing in, I would have my Bible and I would also have a yoga book with me, and I'd kind of combine those threads. So took a little tangent away from disability specifically, but I do think it's important to acknowledge that spiritual accessibility is one of those things that can make yoga a lot more comfortable for people from different walks of life. So I'll just run through my research methods a little bit. I wanted to talk about some of the interviews that I gave and a few common threads in those interviews. So I spoke to yoga studio owners, I talked to yoga teachers and practitioners, all who have some kind of physical disability. And I spoke with all of them in the Boulder area. I'm coming from Boulder, Colorado. I don't even remember if I said that, but I am in Boulder, Colorado, so that's where I interviewed people, and I really got a really good um, view of how the disabled community and the yoga community in Boulder tend to interface. And really what I found is that those communities are not interfacing very much here. In other parts of the country and the world, I'm sure it's different, but where I am living, the mainstream yoga here is not very adaptive. And literally everyone I interviewed said that they prefer to do their yoga practice at home or in a very small group rather than going to any of the studios around here. Even the woman I spoke to who used to own a yoga studio, she owned it in a different state, and she said that when she moved here, it was a very stark difference on how yoga here was much less accessible to people with disabilities. And it really took a lot for her to reground into her practice coming to Boulder. Another thread from my interviews was um, I spoke to practitioners, teachers, owners about how they feel about hands-on assists. And hands-on assists are something that's been in postural yoga since, a really long time. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of studios have come away from hands-on assists, which is totally understandable. And that distance and that lack of contact will actually make the classes more accessible for some people. But it really does do a disservice to some other people because hands-on adjustments and assists can be very, very supportive to people with different kinds of physical access needs. And then on the flip side of that coin, physical assists can also make yoga a little bit more dangerous for people who have different access needs. If the teacher is unaware and does an assist that person is not, that's not good for that person's body, it could be really harmful. So it's one thing I gathered from these interviews was we think it's really important to be teaching hands-on assist, to be teaching hands-on and to be having teachers practice on as many bodies as possible and learning really deeply about anatomy, injuries, and disabilities so that they're able to provide assistance, whether it's with or without hands-on assist, but coming from a really informed place. And I'm just going to check on our time really fast so that I know that I am not going over because I will do that. Okay, we're actually doing pretty good here. All right. So personal experience, I've touched on my personal experience a little bit throughout. That was my first research method, was starting to adapt my own yoga practice. And this thesis was actually born out of me adapting my yoga practice. And then I had primary and secondary sources. I touched on several of my sources. I'm not going to have time to touch on all of them, but there is one more that I'll bring up towards the end. So why is this important? Why should we care? Just want to throw in some statistics real quick. As of the latest data from the CDC, approximately 28.7 of US adults, which is around 70 million people, live with some form of disability. So between a quarter and a third of our population in the US is living with a disability. Then that number jumps up to 43.9% of individuals age 65 and older are reporting disability. And disabled is the only marginalized group that anyone can become a part of at any time. And we'll come over here to my little graphic. 20-year-old workers' chances of a disability lasting 6 months or more is 30%, while their chance of death before age 65 is only 18%. So I include this statistic to show that it is far more likely that a person become disabled at some point in their life then that they have a shorter life expectancy. So more people are becoming disabled at some point in their existence in this physical plane than not. And so providing not just yoga, but as many spaces as possible that are accessible and adaptive. It's not about scaring anyone. It's not about, making anyone think that something bad's going to happen to them, but it's about recognizing and acknowledging that anything can happen at any point and being uh, content with that rather than scared of that. And I think it would be much easier for us as a society to be content with that fact if we put more effort into making our spaces accessible. And part of my mission is to do this with yoga spaces. So I threw in some infographics that I made. These are for chair yoga, and I have more. I just wanted to show off some. Um, and if you're interested in having these emailed to you, my email will be at the end, and I can also put it in the chat. And I would be super, super happy to share these graphics with you and more if you're interested. And I just want to point out really quickly how I added in the Sanskrit names of the poses along with the English names. And I chose to do this because I want to keep the integrity of the tradition. These poses were first named in Sanskrit and then later translated into English. And I think that not only are we keeping the integrity of tradition, we're also validating the experience of all practitioners' practice. As I know in some forms of yoga, we would tell someone that this is not warrior one, you're holding on to a chair, but this is warrior one. This is warrior one with support. Same thing with cobra pose here. Cobra pose in most mainstream environments happens on the floor, but we're in the same body position. We just have support. And so keeping alive people's dignity, really, um, giving them access to all of the depth of the tradition is something I really wanted to put across with these graphics. And then here is the cover of an ebook that I am almost finished with. I'll have out soon. And again, just like the graphics, if you'd like to have it emailed to you, I can totally email it to you. And I'm just going to go through, these are the yamas and niyamas, and these are guidelines to accessing yoga in daily life. And my commentary is going to be from the perspective of a disabled woman yoga teacher who wants to bring yoga on a philosophical level to as many people as possible. So the yamas is the first limb of yoga and the niyamas is the second limb of yoga. And I just want to give a quick credit to Deborah Adele. She wrote the yamas and niyamas, exploring yoga's ethical practice. This is a really awesome book to get into the philosophy of yoga practice. So the first yama is ahimsa, or nonviolence. And she talks about how nonviolence is it's the first jewel of yoga and is the most important jewel of yoga. And one way that I have brought this yama into me is I'm going to read a quote from her book. The color of how we treat ourselves is the color of how we treat others. If we can't be safe with ourselves, others can never be safe with us, and the world can never be a safe place to be. So ahimsa starts from within. It starts with being nonviolent to oneself, because what we have on the inside is what we can extend to the outside. No matter how much effort we put forth into being a kind person to other people, if we are regularly unkind to ourselves, it will come out in our relationships and in our interactions with others. Now I'll come to satya, truthfulness. And satya is the second jewel of yoga, and it comes after nonviolence. So it's important to remember that truthfulness is not to be used as a weapon. Truthfulness is to be used in nonviolence. And truthfulness is about seeing things clearly as they are. The fluidity of truth requires that we clean our lens periodically to get new glasses periodically to observe the world with. So here I want to point out that truthfulness is not a stagnant, static thing. Truthfulness is a flow. What is the truth and what isn't the truth can change. We're learning more and more every day. We are gathering more information every day. And then Ashtea, non-stealing, and I'm going through these kind of fast because I want us to do our practice at the end. So there's much more expansion on these that I have. But Ashtea, non-stealing, is we think of non-stealing, we think don't rob a bank, don't steal that thing from the store. Most of us probably have a pretty easy time doing that. But I want to talk about stealing more from an energetic sense. I'm going to talk about stealing from the future. Our focus seems to be on what we don't have or what we might not have in the future rather than the abundance right before us. If we stop long enough to gaze at what is laid out before us, to let the mystery of beauty and wonder of the season sit deeply in our soul, our hearts cannot help but burst forth in thanksgiving and gratitude to life itself. So this particular layer of non-stealing is less about not taking, but it's about not looking so far forward into the future that we're missing what's right in front of us. We're stealing our own experience of what is great about the present if we're constantly worried about what is happening in the future. And this brings us to our next yama, which is brahmacharya, or ethical use of energy, is how I have chosen to translate this. Many people translate it as walking with God or ethical use of sexual energy. And I think all of that ties in. This was a very all-encompassing translation that felt very alive for me. So ethical use of energy, I want to speak on overindulgence. Overindulgence snuffs out the life force like too many logs on a fire overpowers the fire. Practicing the ethical use of energy preserves and honors this life force within us so that we can live with clarity and sacredness. So it's about making sure that our cup is neither too empty nor too full. We're not taking more than what we need for ourselves, and we're not giving more than we have to give. And then that brings us to aparigraha, or non-grasping. So this can be translated in many, many different ways but I like non-grasping because it's the most literal and there's a good mental image with that. So I'm going to talk about attachment a little bit. Grasping to things, if we try to attach ourselves to things, more often than not, those things will attach themselves to us and start to become like a leech. The word attachment can be traced to the root word to nail. Attachments are like nailing ourselves to the need for something to continue to be the same and to always be there for us in the same way. When we nail ourselves to the needs for others, to our feelings, our roles, our agendas, our pleasures, or our identities, we become more like rats in a maze than human beings. So if we are constantly grasping onto something that we think might be better, something that we think could happen in the future, kind of harkens back to uh, our other yamas that we've talked about so far. We're stealing ourselves from the present, and we are stealing our consciousness from just being grateful for what we have. And we're also limiting our ability to let go of the things that no longer serve us or that no longer serve others. So now I'm going to come into the niyamas. This is the second limb of yoga. And the yamas are kind of a little bit more of like what not to do. And these are more what to do, to put it really, really simply. So Saucha, I have translated this as cleanliness. Often people translate this as purity. I wanted to ground it a little bit more because I wanted to bring in a reminder that yoga happens in our daily life. And if we've ever heard the expression cleanliness is next to godliness, that's kind of what I'm getting at here, that keeping, and it's not, it goes beyond physical cleanliness, of course, keeping our spaces clean, ourselves clean, but it's also about keeping our minds clean, our speech clean, and there's a reason why nonviolence and cleanliness are next to each other. At least I put them next to each other because part of keeping ourselves clean will help us stay nonviolent. Then santosha, or contentment, is about not allowing the fluctuations of emotion to affect our emotional state. And I'll explain kind of the difference there. Our emotions are going to do all different kinds of things. We will get happy, we will get sad, and it is perfectly understandable that things that happen on the outside world will make us happy, sad, joyful, frustrated, and we can still keep a grounded emotional state. It is okay to feel and give space to those emotions as long as we are still able to stay content with our lives. When we give the power of our emotional state to someone or something outside of ourselves, we have made ourselves helpless. And so part of yoga practice is practicing working with those emotions that come up and working with ensuring that they don't taint your entire emotional state. Think of all the times that we say to ourselves, I just had such a bad day because of one thing that didn't quite go our way. And I invite you to look at each moment from a more present place and not allowing a bad moment to color your entire day as bad. And now I'll talk about tapas, discipline. This one is a tricky one because it can sometimes get mistranslated as don't attend to your needs. Just go, 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 burn, burn, burn. Um, Discipline, there is discipline in work and there is also discipline in rest. And true tapas, true discipline is finding a balance between the two where we can be active members of our communities, active participants in our lives, take care of our loved ones, and attend to ourselves. Tapas is the day-to-day choice to burn non-supportive habits of the body and mind, choosing to forsake momentary pleasures for future rewards. So tapas is the practice of knowing that what you're doing for yourself now is going to positively affect you in the future. And I'll just add that, we're not going to be perfect at this one all the time, but the invitation and the encouragement is to try. And now we'll talk about svadhyaya, self-reflection or self-study. And I chose reflection in the cover of this book because we're learning about ourselves as we start to see ourselves in the ways that we learn about the world a lot of the time. So we'll see ourself reflecting onto situations, onto relationships, onto our our interactions. And we can then start to practice this niyama by reflecting on how we noticed ourselves and becoming not just a witness to the world around us, but a witness to ourselves, and taking full responsibility and accountability for the ways in our lives that we can make positive change, and taking full responsibility and accountability for the ways that we can't. And really just recognizing that every facet, everything that we can love or hate about another person, we've seen it in ourselves first. And so when we find ourselves really just thinking that the world is against us, or we find ourselves feeling sorry for ourselves, I think that is the best time to reflect on where these things that we're seeing in the world come from within us. And our last niyama is Ishvara Pranidhana. And this translates, the translation that I have come up with is surrender to the heart. And I took a lot of, um, I gathered a lot from Nishala Joy Devi on this one, because Ishvara Pranidhana most often is translated to surrender to the divine. And in order to make this the most accessible to anyone who might have any kind of belief, I've chosen surrender to the heart because we do all have a heart. We have our energetic heart space. We've got our thumping heart up here on the left side. And Ishvara Pranidhana is the jewel of surrender, and it presupposes that there is a divine force at work in our lives, whatever you call it. You might call it God, grace, providence, life, the universe. You might call it the law of attraction. Whatever belief you have about an outside force that works on our lives, that is the essence of Ishvara Pranidhana. That is what we are surrendering to. Surrender invites us to be active participants in our lives, totally present and fluid with each moment, while appreciating the magnitude and mystery of what we are participating in. Ultimately, this guideline invites us to surrender our egos, open up our hearts, and accept the higher purpose of being. And I am going to end us with that right there.